The calendar reads May 1945. Across Europe, the sound of artillery fire is fading, replaced by an eerie silence. German forces have surrendered unconditionally just days ago. In the wreckage of a defeated Third Reich, Allied soldiers are making discoveries that would reshape the post-war world. Deep beneath the Austrian Alps, in salt mines concealed from Allied bombers, they find something that stops them cold. Imagine walking through the corridors of the Kaiserode salt mine near the German town of Merkers on the morning of April 6, 1945. Your torch sweeps across stacks upon stacks of gold bars, bags of coins, currency from every occupied nation. On this day alone, American soldiers would document nearly $238 million worth of Nazi treasures. But this discovery raises an urgent question. Much of this gold came from Swiss banks. Neutral Switzerland had accepted Nazi gold, vast quantities of it, exchanging precious metal for currency needed to fuel Hitler's war machine. By the time the guns fell silent, Swiss institutions held an estimated $440 million in Nazi gold, a stunning amount in an era before digital banking. The question that haunted the Allies was simple but profound. The war was over, but a new mystery was just beginning. What really happened to all that gold? Where did it go? And more importantly, who was going to make sure it actually went back to its rightful owners? To understand what happened after 1945, you first need to grasp the sheer magnitude of what Switzerland had done during the war. Beginning in 1939 and continuing until 1945, Nazi Germany systematically plundered the gold reserves of every nation it conquered. Austria surrendered 83 tons of gold. Czechoslovakia lost 3.5 tons. Belgium and the Netherlands were gutted of over 200 tons combined. When the Nazis needed foreign currency to purchase raw materials, food and weapons from neutral countries, they melted this looted gold into standardized bars and sold it to willing buyers. Switzerland was, by far, the most willing buyer. Approximately 80% of all Nazi gold sold internationally went directly to Switzerland. The Swiss National Bank and various commercial banks in Zurich purchased roughly 1.7 billion Swiss francs worth of Nazi gold, worth over $8 billion in modern currency. What made this possible was Switzerland's declared neutrality. While bombs fell on London and tanks rolled through France, Switzerland remained officially uninvolved in the war. This neutrality gave Swiss banks tremendous credibility. More importantly, Switzerland possessed something no other nation possessed in abundance during wartime: the Swiss franc, the only freely convertible currency in the world outside the American dollar. Germany desperately needed convertible currency. Switzerland desperately wanted gold. The arrangement was mutually beneficial, at least for the Swiss and Nazi officials. When Germany surrendered on May 7, 1945, Swiss banks suddenly had a serious problem. The Nazis who had deposited their looted treasures were no longer customers. They were fugitives or corpses. Within days of the surrender, the Allies began demanding answers. American and British negotiators descended on Switzerland with a simple message: hand over the Nazi gold or face sanctions that would cripple your economy. Swiss government officials protested that they had acted in good faith, that they could never have known the gold's true origins. This defense crumbled almost immediately. Documents discovered in German archives made clear that Swiss bankers had knowingly purchased stolen gold. They had received shipments that bore stamps identifying them as originating from Auschwitz and other concentration camps. Dental gold extracted from murdered Jews had been melted down, refined, and sold to Switzerland. Yet despite this overwhelming evidence, the Swiss negotiating position was surprisingly strong. The Allies needed Swiss cooperation for other reasons. Swiss banks still held German assets. Switzerland remained a crucial neutral ground in the emerging Cold War, and the Allies themselves were not entirely united on how harshly to punish Switzerland for its wartime collaboration. What followed were months of intense negotiation. On one side, American diplomats and their British counterparts gathered evidence, interview after interview, document after document. On the other side, Swiss officials insisted that they had not known the gold was looted. It was, they claimed, a matter between the Germans and the Swiss banks, not between Switzerland and the Allies. These negotiations did not occur in the vacuum of historical justice. They occurred in the context of a world divided between Soviet and Western spheres. Switzerland's strategic location made it too valuable to alienate completely. By the spring of 1946, a deal was struck that would define the fate of Nazi gold for the next 50 years. On June 25, 1946, Swiss officials signed the Washington Agreement. It would become the foundational document governing what happened to Nazi gold in Swiss banks. Under the agreement's terms, Switzerland agreed to transfer 250 million Swiss francs worth of gold to the Allies. To put this in context, this represented only about 15% of the looted gold the Swiss had actually received during the war. The remaining 85% would remain in Swiss hands, either to be kept in their vaults or used to offset Switzerland's own claimed losses from the war. In exchange for this token transfer, Switzerland received something invaluable, a clean bill of health. The agreement explicitly stated that Switzerland bore no recognition of legal obligation. In the eyes of international law, Switzerland had committed no crime. They were innocent. American officials were furious. British officials felt betrayed. But the deal was done. A Swiss journalist covering the negotiations would later write that the Swiss delegation felt the Allied demands had been unreasonable, and yet they had managed to negotiate down to a fraction of what was originally demanded. The 250 million Swiss francs in gold that Switzerland did transfer was loaded onto ships and trains bound for the Tripartite Gold Commission. This mysterious-sounding organization would become the machinery through which Nazi gold was redistributed after the war. The Tripartite Gold Commission consisted of representatives from the United States, Britain, and France. Their mandate was extraordinarily complex: to take the recovered Nazi gold and distribute it back to the nations from which it had been stolen. But here is where the first major mystery deepens. The commission would not simply return the gold to its rightful owners. In many cases, the rightful owners no longer existed. Poland's government was now under Soviet control. Austria was divided into 4 occupation zones. Belgium and the Netherlands were occupied by allies. The commission's solution was elegant but troubling. They would distribute the gold based on a formula that accounted for which nations had suffered the greatest losses during German occupation. But this formula had a blind spot. It made almost no provision for individual victims, for the families of the murdered, for survivors of concentration camps who had lost everything. The precious gold extracted from the teeth of gas chamber victims would not go to their families. It would go to governments. It would be reintegrated into national treasuries. The symmetry was brutally poetic in its injustice. What made this situation even more mysterious was what happened to the gold that Switzerland had refused to hand over. The other 85%, the roughly $375 million worth that Swiss banks kept for themselves, vanished from public scrutiny almost entirely. Officially, the Swiss government claimed it had been seized to cover reparations, but the reality was far murkier. In 1998, declassified documents revealed that much of this gold had never been seized at all. It had been mixed into the general reserves of the Swiss National Bank. It had been integrated so completely into Switzerland's gold supply that it became impossible to distinguish Nazi loot from legitimately obtained gold. Some of it was used to back the Swiss franc. Some of it was sold on international markets. Some of it was held in vaults, its origins forgotten. The Swiss had effectively washed 85% of Nazi gold clean. They had taken the stolen gold of murdered civilians, enemy nations, and plundered treasuries, and they had simply made it part of their national wealth. But this is only half of the story. We must now address what happened to the gold that did flow through official channels, that did go to the Tripartite Gold Commission. The commission's work was slow and methodical. Throughout 1947 and 1948, gold bars were carefully inventoried, weighed, and distributed according to the formula. Imagine walking through the vaults of the Bank of England in 1947, where some of this gold was temporarily stored. The bars gleam under electric light, each one stamped with a swastika or Nazi insignia. American soldiers stand guard. Accountants with leather ledgers record every transaction. The gold that went to Belgium was used to rebuild its shattered economy. The gold that went to the Netherlands helped reconstruct Rotterdam, a city that had been systematically destroyed by German bombing. The gold that went to Austria was similarly used for reconstruction, even though Austria itself was divided among the occupying powers. France received gold that was integrated into its reserves and used to stabilize the franc during the reconstruction period. Yet even as this redistribution occurred, another mystery was unfolding. Not all of the looted gold had been sent to Switzerland. Some of it had remained in German hands, hidden in salt mines, buried in forests, or locked in vaults beneath bombed-out buildings. When American troops liberated Merkers, they found not just gold from Swiss transactions, but gold from sources across Europe. Similarly, when the Soviets advanced from the east, they discovered massive hoards of gold in places like the Reichsbank itself. The Soviets simply took what they found and incorporated it into their own reserves. They never submitted reports to the Tripartite Gold Commission. They never acknowledged exactly how much they had captured. American officials estimated the Soviets took over 185 tons of gold from German supplies, but the real number remains unknown to this day. The Soviets kept their secrets, and the Cold War made it impossible to demand otherwise. This is where the story takes a turn toward the truly strange and largely unknown. In the 1950s and 1960s, as the Cold War deepened, Western governments gradually lost interest interest in pursuing the gold question further. The Tripartite Gold Commission continued its work, but with less and less urgency. By the 1960s, its meetings had become perfunctory. The major governments had already received their share. The practical purpose had been served. But then, in the 1970s, something unexpected happened. Researchers and historians began publishing accounts of wartime gold dealings that contradicted the official narrative. Swedish historians discovered that Sweden, another neutral nation, had also accepted Nazi gold, perhaps more than Switzerland on a per capita basis. British historians revealed that the Bank of England had knowingly accepted gold from Nazi sources, even as it condemned Switzerland for doing the same. American historians found evidence that Swiss gold was still circulating in American banks well into the 1950s. Suddenly, the neat settlement of 1946 did not look so neat anymore. It looked like one of the greatest shell games of the 20th century, with the Western powers colluding to hide their own complicity. In 1996, 60 years after the Washington Agreement, pressure from Holocaust survivors groups finally forced a comprehensive audit. The Swiss government launched an independent inquiry. The results were devastating. The inquiry confirmed what survivors had long suspected. Swiss banks had engaged in systematic plunder of the assets of murdered Jews. They had seized the accounts of Holocaust victims. They had transformed looted gold into accounts that the banks themselves kept, accumulating wealth that was never returned. The inquiry identified what was called dormant accounts, accounts that had belonged to Holocaust victims, accounts that the victims could no longer claim because they were dead. These accounts contained an estimated 7 million Swiss francs, a fortune in that era. Some of this money was eventually distributed to survivors through settlement agreements, but much of it was never traced to individual victims. It simply disappeared into the broader economy. This discovery opened a door that had been sealed for 50 years. What followed was a cascade of lawsuits, investigations, and international pressure. In 1998, Swiss banks reached a settlement with Holocaust survivors groups, agreeing to pay $1.25 billion in compensation. But this settlement did not answer the fundamental question: where was all the gold? The 250 million Swiss francs transferred to the Allies in 1946 had been distributed through official channels. But what of the rest? Some of it, perhaps 40 to 50 tons, was eventually identified in various national reserves. American investigators found that some Nazi gold had been melted down and recast into new bars that were then sold to other nations, including Arab countries and emerging African nations in the 1950s and 1960s. Britain discovered that some of the gold it had received was of uncertain origin, possibly Nazi loot that had been laundered through multiple intermediaries. Even Switzerland itself, decades later, admitted it could not account for hundreds of tons of gold that should have been in its vaults based on wartime records. The strangest discovery came in 1995 when a British researcher named Ian Sayer was examining captured German documents. He found evidence that Nazi officials, in the final days of the war, had transferred at least 100 tons of gold to Switzerland after the official surrender date. This gold had been smuggled across borders after May 7, 1945, through a network that included not just Nazi sympathizers but also certain neutral officials. Sayer's research suggested that some of this late-arriving gold was never officially recorded. It simply entered Switzerland's reserve system and was never accounted for in the Washington Agreement. When pressed, Swiss officials claimed they had no records of receiving this gold, but their claim was demonstrably false. Documents showed that the Swiss National Bank had received mysterious shipments in May and June of 1945 with no clear origin documented. What happened to this unaccounted-for gold remains one of the war's genuine mysteries. Some researchers believe it was melted down and incorporated into the Swiss franc, making it literally the basis of Switzerland's post-war economic miracle. Others argue it was sold to emerging nations in the 1950s and 1960s during the height of decolonization. A few believe significant quantities were smuggled to Argentina, where some Nazi war criminals had escaped. The truth is that we may never know with certainty. The gold, once physical and traceable, had become intangible, embedded in currency supplies and national reserves across the world. You cannot point to a bar of gold today and definitively say it was looted from Auschwitz. Once melted down and recast, once integrated into the broader monetary system, it becomes anonymous. This anonymity is perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the entire episode. The gold of the Holocaust, the physical embodiment of Nazi theft and murder, was not destroyed. It was not dramatically hidden away in some secret location. It was absorbed. It was processed through official channels. It was split among victors and victims' nations in carefully calculated percentages. It became the foundation of post-war European reconstruction. A wall in Brussels was rebuilt with bricks purchased with money that came from gold extracted from murdered bodies. A bridge in Amsterdam was constructed using funds traceable to looted Austrian reserves. The gold continued to do exactly what the Nazis had intended. It moved wealth, it enabled power, It built empires. The only difference was that the emblem on the bar had changed. In recent years, with the opening of archives and the declassification of documents, historians have been able to trace specific quantities of gold with greater precision. The International Monetary Fund conducted a comprehensive review in 2002 that tracked the flow of gold from the end of the war through the 1960s. Their conclusion was sobering. While the Tripartite Gold Commission did return significant quantities to the nations from which it had been stolen, the process was fundamentally corrupted by Cold War politics and national self-interest. The Soviet Union's unaccounted-for haul remained unaccounted for. Switzerland's refusal to fully submit to Allied demands meant that hundreds of millions of dollars worth of gold remained outside the official redistribution system, and the gold that was distributed often went to governments that themselves engaged in theft and suppression. Today, the gold bars themselves rarely surface in public consciousness. Most of what was recovered and officially redistributed remains locked in the vaults of central banks. The Federal Reserve in New York, the Bank of England, the Banque de France, all hold gold whose origins trace back to the Nazi era. Even if the paperwork now lists them as legitimately held, some bars still bear the scars of their history. Certain specimens found their way into private collections and museums. In the German Historical Museum in Berlin, visitors can view bars of Nazi gold alongside photographs of the camps, a jarring juxtaposition that forces acknowledgement of the moral bankruptcy of those who profited. The Austrian National Bank holds samples with Reichsbank stamps still visible. A few pieces ended up in Holocaust memorials, relics of a time when metal itself seemed tainted by evil. What might surprise modern observers is how thoroughly the gold issue has faded from contemporary discussion. The Tripartite Gold Commission officially closed its operations in 1998 after more than 50 years of work. By that point, the world had moved on. The Soviet Union had collapsed. Germany was reunified. Europe was integrating. The gold felt like ancient history, a problem solved, a mystery closed. But for Holocaust survivors and descendants of victims, it remained an open wound. The gold that had been extracted from the bodies of their murdered relatives was never going to be returned to them. It would never sit in a survivor's trust. It had been transformed into the currency of nations, into the infrastructure of cities, into the reserves that backed the economies of the post-war world. Justice in this case meant official acknowledgement of historical fact and modest financial compensation. It did not mean returning what had been taken. One particularly fascinating and little-known aspect of this history involves the Bank of International Settlements, an organization that operated throughout the war with remarkable freedom. Located in Basel, Switzerland, the BIS continued to facilitate transactions between neutral nations and Nazi Germany, essentially acting as a financial intermediary for the Reich. After 1945, investigations revealed that the BIS had handled transfers of looted gold worth millions of dollars. Yet remarkably, the BIS escaped serious consequences. Like Switzerland itself, it claimed neutrality and ignorance. The organization still exists today as the central bank for central banks, a reminder that some institutions managed to wash away their wartime associations completely. Another intriguing mystery concerns the specific shipments that moved through Portuguese ports in the final months of the war. Portugal, like Switzerland, maintained official neutrality while conducting extensive trade with Nazi Germany. Intelligence reports suggest that Nazi gold was transferred to Portugal in late 1944 and early 1945, possibly to create backup reserves in case Germany lost Switzerland. The Portuguese government has never fully opened its archives on this matter. Some historians believe that certain quantities of gold ended up in Portuguese banks and were never properly documented or returned. The full extent of Portuguese involvement in Nazi gold transfers remains one of the war's unsolved financial mysteries. What is clear is that the Allies' focus on Switzerland led them to overlook these other potential hiding places and money laundering operations. The human dimension of this story is equally haunting. Imagine being a Holocaust survivor in 1950, rebuilding your life in America or Palestine, aware that the gold extracted from the bodies of your family members was being used to reconstruct Europe. You had no claim to that gold. The international community had decided it belonged to nations, not to individuals. Some survivors attempted to file claims through the reparations system, but the process was Byzantine and often unsuccessful. The survivors who received any compensation often received pittance compared to the actual value of what had been taken. A widow whose husband's gold teeth had been melted down might receive a few $100s in settlement. A man who lost 3 children might receive a token payment. The mathematics of justice simply did not work when attempting to quantify human suffering against the value of gold. In the 1980s and 1990s, as survivors aged and faced mortality, pressure mounted for a final reckoning. Documentary filmmakers began investigating the gold trail with new urgency. Journalists in Switzerland and America published exposés revealing the complexity of what had been hidden. These journalists and researchers became the unlikely heroes of this delayed justice. Without their work, the story would likely have remained locked in archives, forgotten by a world that preferred to move forward. The journalist Tom Bauer, the researcher Ian Sayer, and many others dedicated years to piecing together the scattered evidence. Their persistence eventually convinced governments to act where they had preferred silence. The settlement reached in 1998 between Swiss banks and Holocaust survivors was historic, but it represented both progress and admission of defeat. The $1.25 billion payment was substantial, yet everyone understood it could never be sufficient. How do you price the life of a person? How do you value the gold from their teeth? The settlement did, however, establish a principle that institutions cannot simply profit from atrocities and claim ignorance. It created a legal precedent that echoed through subsequent cases involving looted art, stolen property, and other war crimes compensation. What few people realize is that the hunt for Nazi gold continued well into the 1970s and 1980s. American intelligence agencies operating under the assumption that Nazi leaders might have hidden gold for a future resurrection of the Reich searched for caches in South America, particularly in Argentina. The CIA had suspicions that large quantities of gold had been transferred to Argentina through neutral banking systems, possibly ending up in private collections or remaining hidden in remote locations. These investigations largely proved fruitless, though they did confirm that significant quantities of gold left Europe through routes that were never fully traced. Whether this gold remains hidden or was ultimately melted down and reintegrated into the global monetary system remains unclear. The story of Nazi gold also illuminates a broader truth about the post-war international order. The victors created a system of justice that served their interests while maintaining relationships with countries they needed during the Cold War. Switzerland was too valuable as a banking center and a neutral ground to be severely punished. Sweden, which had sent nearly as much gold to Nazi Germany as Switzerland, was barely investigated. The Soviet Union, which had captured and kept significant quantities of looted gold, faced no consequences because it was too powerful to challenge. Justice was selective, pragmatic, and deeply influenced by geopolitical considerations rather than moral principle. This reality disappointed many who had hoped the post-war world would establish a genuinely new ethical foundation. For modern researchers, the Nazi gold story presents an enduring challenge. Most of the gold that was transferred through official channels left only fragmentary traces in the historical record. Central banks are reluctant to open their reserves for full inspections or public accounting. The gold bars themselves, when they do surface, cannot always be definitively traced to specific sources due to the refining and recasting that occurred. It is entirely possible that today, scattered throughout the vaults of central banks from New York to Tokyo to Moscow, there are bars of gold that originated from Auschwitz or other camps. We simply cannot know with certainty because the identification marks have been deliberately obscured by the passage of time and intentional laundering. This, then, is what happened to the 200,000 gold bars hidden by Nazi officers in Swiss banks after the surrender of 1945. Some were transferred through official channels and redistributed to victorious and victim nations. Some were melted down and incorporated into national treasuries. Some were sold on international markets and are now impossible to trace. Some remain locked in vaults, their origins obscured by paperwork and time. The mystery is not one of dramatic discovery or incredible hidden hoards. It is a mystery of how something so clearly evil, wealth derived from mass murder, could be so thoroughly integrated into the legitimate post-war economy that it became invisible. The gold did not disappear, it was simply absorbed, and in that absorption lies a far more troubling truth than any pirate treasure or secret vault ever could. The gold of the Holocaust was not stolen and hidden. It was processed, distributed, and legitimized. It became the foundation upon which the modern world was rebuilt. The infrastructure of democracy was built in part with the wealth of those murdered in the camps, and that, perhaps more than anything else, is the haunting legacy that lingers in the darkness of history.